Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, October 20. This week, we'll take a look at what's happening in the Middle East. Israel appears to be on the brink of a ground invasion in Gaza, and the humanitarian situation in that enclave is getting worse every day. Meantime, fears of escalation are growing around Israel and around the region. President Biden traveled to Israel earlier this week and then gave only his second Oval Office address to address this crisis, as well as the need to help Ukraine. We'll talk about both of those issues in depth. And finally, some good news. In Poland, the ruling government seems to have fallen short of a majority and is likely to be replaced by a coalition that is more committed to both the rule of law and to European unity. Here to talk about all of these issues are the reporters that are covering these stories. Peter Spiegel is U.S. editor of the Financial Times. Stefan Kornelius is political editor of the Süddeutsche Zeitung. And joining us for the first time, Yasmeen Abutaleb, who is the White House reporter for the Washington Post. All three, wonderful to see you. Great to have you on board. Peter, let's start with you on what was happening in the region inside Gaza itself, what the impact is on Israel, and then the region writ large.
Well, thanks, Ivo, and that's exactly the way I want to try to sort of address them, starting with Gaza and then moving out, because as we said before we just came on the air here, there's so much going on, and sometimes it's hard to organize our thoughts around it, but I think that's probably the best way to address it. As you say, we are facing a humanitarian crisis going on right now in Gaza. Our reporters on the ground there who have been reporting back to us said, despite this highly touted agreement that the president reached while traveling to the region to supply aid through the Rafah border, it is not happening today, and there's just a huge amount of disagreement over the logistics there. The Israelis in particular are concerned that the supplies that go through the Rafah border crossings don't go to Hamas, and the numbers that Biden talked about, 20 trucks, is just not sufficient. And from hearing from the UN and from other aid groups on the ground, they need hundreds to deal with this. And this is obviously an issue for the humanitarian crisis on the ground for the Palestinians in Gaza. But just to be too cynical about it, what is the other issue that is going to affect the region, which I'll get to in a second, is we're going to see these images in Gaza just getting worse. And what we've seen in recent days, particularly after this horrible bombing at the hospital, of which blame has been aimed at both sides, seems to have been a missile from Gaza going awry. But what we now know is these images have the power to really stir violence elsewhere in the region, particularly the so-called Arab Street. So it is a humanitarian crisis, but it is also a geopolitical crisis for all players in the region. To move out one layer to Israel, because we're getting somewhat conflicting signals about what the Israelis are up to. I think many of us had expected the ground invasion to start by now, but they clearly are still working on strategy. Again, what we're hearing is, despite fears that the Israelis want to reoccupy Gaza, they don't want to have a permanent presence in Gaza, but there clearly is going to be a weeks, if not months-long invasion in which they seek to dismantle Hamas, a very difficult goal given how embedded they are with the local population. They also want to, in many ways, cut Gaza off from Israel, because remember, a lot of their supplies, their utilities, their electricity comes from Israel. I think that is a mid-term goal, is to basically seal off Gaza even from those supplies, which is going to increase focus on the humanitarian issue. So we are awaiting the Israeli invasion, which we thought has been imminent for days. We think probably that the Biden trip postponed that. But what we've heard from the defense ministry is they are preparing for a long ground invasion. Again, those images are going to be tough. And anyone who has covered wars before, particularly urban warfare, particularly for trying to root out the population, as Mao once said, separating the fish from the ocean, it is very, very difficult from a military point of view. I want to say the most time, though, for this last thing, which is the region, because, again, not to be too cynical about it, but if you're talking to Washington, and Ivo, you and I were talking about this before we went on the air, this is their biggest concern, which is the extent to which what is now a localized conflict will metastasize into something much larger. It is why 2 aircraft carrier groups have gone to the region. It is why Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, has not only sent 2,000 Marines to the region, but has mobilized 2,000 extras to send the message as they say, anyone who is seeking to capitalize on the chaos, by which they mean Iran, does not get ideas. Unfortunately, what we are already seeing is the Iranians, perhaps coordinated, already trying to take advantage here. We've seen many of the proxies. We saw this missile that was fired from Yemen by the Houthi rebels, which are backed by Iran, shot down by an American destroyer in the Red Sea. We clearly think, or at least the Pentagon thinks, that was a missile from Iranian-backed rebels aimed at Israel that was stopped by the Americans. We've seen increased drone activity in Syria and in Iraq, where again the perception is that Iran is trying to attack U.S. and allied forces in those regions. And then the most disturbing thing of all is the increased activity on the South Lebanese border with Israel, which again we assume is being triggered by Hezbollah, a much larger, much more well-armed, much more better organized Iranian-backed resistance movement within on the Israeli border. And there is some fear that if and when Israel does go into Gaza, that Hezbollah will start a much more active advance in the north of Israel along the Lebanese border. The reason the Americans are most concerned about that is perhaps obvious, but I'd just like to restate them. One is this has been a long-running, low-grade conflict between the Shia power of Iran and its proxies in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Israel, in Gaza, and the increasingly close relationship between the Sunnis kingdoms in the Gulf and Israel, the Saudis in particular, but obviously the Emiratis and the Qataris, where you have on one side the Sunni royals and the Israelis becoming increasingly strong because of their fear about what Iran is doing in the region. If this becomes a regional war between Shia Iran and its proxies, Israel and its, slightly odd to even say this, its Sunni allies, we are talking potentially a shutting down the Straits of Hormuz, oil rocketing up to well above $100 a barrel. That is bad for the global economy. That's bad for re-election prospects. It's bad for all sorts of things. And so there's a real nervousness now that despite the show of force by the U.S. Navy, by other elements of the U.S. military, that the Iranians are primed to take advantage of this opportunity to make to squeeze the Israelis, to squeeze the Saudis, and to squeeze the Americans. And that right now, I think, is probably where most of the strategic thinkers in Washington are focused, because that is potentially a very violent and very disruptive war. Whereas now, not that things are going well, but it's contained. So this is, I think, where we need to watch. We need to watch, and again, the developments of the last 24, 40 hours are particularly disturbing because it does seem that the Iranians are beginning to push on it, despite the American warnings, and we're having actual kinetic activity in all these venues. And that is where I think if people are trying to get their thoughts ordered, where the real focus needs to be over the weekend in particular.
Peter, thanks. That depressing, but I think a very realistic set of thoughts about the humanitarian situation, the dilemma that Israel faces on how does it crush Hamas without destroying Gaza in the process, and of course this dynamic of escalation. And Yasmeen, we'll talk in a minute, of course, about Biden's trip and Biden's speech. But just to Peter's last point about this fear of escalation. My conversation with folks in Washington also suggests that this is heating up as a real worry, for not only for the reason of Iran, but also a worry that the street will just force people to move in a direction in which, whether Iran likes it or not, might just escalate. Truly for Hezbollah, and of course in the West Bank, but for the rest of the region too. What are you hearing when you walk around the corridors of power in D.C.?
I think you're absolutely right. There is an enormous fear of this escalating. And I think that term has been used a little bit vaguely and not well defined, but I think it's sort of twofold. There's this fear that, other regional actors jump in. I don't think we're necessarily talking about, the government of Saudi Arabia or Egypt putting troops on the ground and joining this war, but other militant groups in the area, of course, as was discussed earlier, Iran and its proxies jumping into this conflict. But the second part of this is just the simmering rage that is all over the Arab world right now. We of course saw the president's trip to Amman this week get canceled, where he was supposed to meet with Arab leaders. And I think that, I've spoken to people about, what do they think the outcome of this trip was. I think that is going to be very challenging for the administration, because what ended up happening, even though this was not the intent, was that President Biden only went to Tel Aviv. He went and affirmed the Israeli version of events of what happened at Al-Ahli Hospital, that it was not the Israelis. And, the US obviously has intelligence and assessments to back up that claim. But I think it's important to note that that is really not going to carry weight in the Arab world. And so I think what ended up happening was that President Biden only went to Israel. He affirmed this version of events. And to be clear, the hospital is a major event. I think it's a pivot point in that it sort of brought all of the rage and fury around this issue to the surface in the Arab world. And the second part of the escalation is just U.S. citizens and U.S. personnel who are in the Middle East. Of course, we saw, this top travel advisory from the State Department for Lebanon. Now there's a worldwide caution about traveling, just because of the unpredictability of events everywhere. And so I think that's a part of escalation that hasn't been discussed quite as clearly, is that there is just fear that everything is so unpredictable. There are these massive protests in the Arab world. We saw in Amman, there were massive protests around the Israeli embassy. And so I think there is a lot of fear about this sort of twofold escalation that we see happening, and that I don't think President Biden has a lot of credibility in the Arab world right now.
Can I just jump on that just to reinforce what Yasmeen just said? Because I think a lot of the debate over the last 24, 48 hours, 72 hours after the hospital bombing has been, as she said, the psyops, or who's to blame? What does the intelligence show? What is the open source intelligence? That debate almost misses the point, which is, regardless of who's to blame, as Yasmeen said, there has been protest and violence in the West Bank, in Lebanon. The street is inflamed. And it's only going to get worse, right? In any war, there is going to be collateral damage. We all know that even if we abide by what the Americans are telling the Israelis to do, which is abide by the rules of war, there is going to be collateral damage. There are going to be dead civilians in Gaza, and it's going to be at the hands of the Israelis. I mean, we know this is going to happen if there's a ground invasion. So the fact that even what we think is probably a own goal, to use a rather crass term, in Gaza, at the hospital, inflamed the streets when it wasn't even the Israelis' fault. We don't think necessarily. There is going to be multiple incidents during a ground invasion in which Palestinian civilians are killed, and there will be images of it. And I think that is, as Yasmeen said, as dangerous as whatever Iran does with its proxies in the region.
Yeah, and in some ways that's already happening. Of course, the number of Gazan casualties are in the thousands, and of course, 1 million people have been told to move in a place where it's hard to move. Stefan, I want to bring you in here because really interested to see how is the European debate changing, which in the beginning was a traditional debate about who's to blame, Israel, Palestine, where do we send our focus on, but to what extent is this larger problem of escalation and of the spread of violence, including very much into Europe itself? We saw some significant terrorist attacks in France, in Belgium, over the last week. What's the debate like in Europe?
Right, but let me start with the comment first, because you are just shared a very American-centric view, and let me tell you from the European point of view, one of the big shifts I do observe compared to previous incidents of violence in the Middle East is that the U.S. factor, from the point of view here, seems to be diminished much more than it used to be all the time. So the American ability to engage, to bring things down, don't appear to be that overwhelmingly present there, and rather my assumption is Israel holding back on the ground offensive right now might actually be due to the calculation that this might backfire and might actually bring up the ground war on various fronts. So let's see how this develops. From the European perspective, there's a lot of perplexity on how quickly this story basically turned against Israel. And we had this horrendous terror incident. We had this brutal, murderous, just animal-like thing which happened a week ago. And all of a sudden, I mean, within 2 days, the public mood has turned. Also in most of European capitals, what we do see reflected within the European Union is the classic battle between pro-Palestine and pro-Israel forces, but the weights have shifted towards the Palestine side, and this is the remarkable phenomena right now, that you don't have the staunch support. Basically, what's happening is that Netanyahu is paying for years of one-sided policies, which is now being assessed and which is now being filtered in or brought into the calculus and being taken against what the Palestinian side now does. The European do have a second dilemma. The number of Arab refugees coming into various European countries over the past years have tremendously increased, mostly from Syria and from Iraq. And those refugees are now making themselves heard. We had a fatal casualty in France. There was an Islamist incident in Belgium against Swedish citizens, which doesn't necessarily seem to be linked to the Middle East. But then again, there is a groundswell of violence. We do now have, for the third night in a row in Berlin, upheavals, cars burning, police out on the streets trying to bring back those migrant groups with Muslim background, try to get them under control. So there is all of a sudden a lot of violence, potential for violence on the streets within Europe, and a fear that this might spill over. This definitely filters into the migration debate in our European societies. This filters into the question of right-wing extremism rise all over Europe. So it destabilizes the political landscape on this continent as well. It's a breathtaking effect the whole situation has on the world, the polarizing effect on societies. And even though Germany is a staunch supporter of Israel for all the obvious historic reasons and current reasons, you do see this gap between the elites, the political elites, and those making themselves heard on the streets, pretty much the same as we see in the Arab world, where the elites don't wish to be engulfed in this conflict, but where they can't withhold that there is a huge mass of people out there just having an extremely one-sided view on the conflict.
Hey, Stefan, can I ask you, because you mentioned at the outset, which I think is a fascinating topic, which is sort of this vacuum of American leadership, which is probably down to a couple of factors. One, obviously 4 years of Trumpism, which has undermined American credibility abroad, but even obviously in the region going back to George W. Bush and the Iraq War and the fallout from that. I think you're right in that the Americans' ability to play honest broker or even a power projector in the region is incredibly diminished. But I'm just curious from a European point of view, if there's anyone there who can fill the vacuum, or whether we're a bit doomed here, because obviously there's been infighting between von der Leyen and Charles Michel about what statements are said and who's visiting Israel when. Schultz very quickly went to Israel, but again doesn't seem to have the stature of even Angela Merkel on the world stage. Is there any hope that that in the absence of American leadership, or at least in the absence of American credibility in the region, that there's any other allied power that can go in and try to be an honest broker that can bring some sort of influence in the region?
I don't see a single person filling in that gap, but in combination, a couple of people could do. And what I do see is detect is a lot of talking amongst allies right now. I mean, Schultz was constantly on the line with the White House, trying to get message in line with what the president would say a day later. Schultz was the first big one to visit. Von der Leyen, the EU Commission president, was hindered because of her role. She has to be a sort of kind of a neutral figure, which she didn't want to be, in respect to all those voices within the European Union who are much more pro-Palestine. And you mentioned Charles Michel, who is president of the other entity, the Council, and he's definitely sort of a symbol for these other voices to be heard. And you do have all the European leaders being now bound by their domestic problems. Look at President Macron from France, whose biggest concern is that Paris will go up in flames. And he managed to contain public anger right now by not actually exposing himself too much in favor of Israel. But this is the price which has to be paid. And I wonder whether after the extremely promising diplomatic engagement from Secretary Blinken in the first hand, there might now be a second round. We might see this Egypt conference coming up on Saturday. Nobody really gives much hope on this, but then again, it's an opportunity for them bringing together. And if there's a combination of bringing in aid to the Palestinians, to the Gazan people, of probably holding back a little bit more with the ground offensives, or doing very, very distinct pushes into Gaza and being extremely careful on this, there might be an opportunity to tone down, to gain some moment, to win some time, actually, and get things a little bit less agitated. Because right now, if this starts this weekend, I'm really not that hopeful that things can be contained.
Yasmeen, you wanted to jump in, and so do, and also, I mean, tell us a little bit about the Biden trip. You already mentioned that not going to Amman created problems, and I think there was even at one moment a hesitation to whether they should go at all, given that it was canceled just as he was on the tarmac to take off for Israel. And also, of course, his speech, a very, very big speech yesterday that tried to create a different framework to put this particular event into a larger framework.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, Stefan, I just wanted to add to your point about how there's this divide between the political elites and then some of the protests in the street, that we're seeing some of that in the US too, maybe to a lesser degree. I did a story earlier in the week about how some Democrats were starting to sort of splinter from the Biden administration position of full-throated support for Israel. It's not a huge number, so I don't want to overstate it, but you do see, some progressives and even some more moderate Democrats, not necessarily breaking with President Biden's position, but saying, we really also need to focus on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. You've seen the president talk a little bit more about that in the last few days than he was maybe in the first week after the Hamas attack. And so I think that's been a sort of notable shift, that they realize they need to strike this balance if they're going to successfully tamp down the risk of escalation in the region. And then, of course, you saw a massive protest at the Capitol this week of people calling for a ceasefire. So, I don't think this is the majority opinion in the United States, but there was a poll that came out this week that showed young people, I think generally under 35, are overwhelmingly sort of more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause and maybe less inclined to support huge amounts of military aid to Israel than older groups. So that is, I think that's quite a shift from where this issue was, a decade or two ago. For President Biden's trip, there was obviously a debate about whether to go in the first place. I think there was this hope that if he spent a few hours in Israel and then spent a few hours in Amman meeting with Arab leaders and, of course, the Palestinian Authority president, Mahmoud Abbas, that, that would sort of balance and show that he's taking a balanced approach to the region. And like you said, it was the Arab summit was canceled as he was already on the tarmac at Joint Base Andrews. And I think they saw that it was sort of too late to cancel at that point, and they wanted to, they made the point of saying on the way over that they were going to ask the Israelis, quote unquote, tough questions about what they were going to do, which was the first time we've seen them indicate that they may have some concern about what Israel plans to do and what its end game is. I think the president's trip I think it's going to be one of the more noteworthy points in his presidency. He flew into an active war zone, which he did earlier this year in Kyiv. I think this was a little bit less risky than that, but still it was notable. And he made the point while he was there that he's the first president to visit Israel while it's in a war. And I think you alluded to this earlier. He said while he was there, he was extremely sympathetic to what the Israelis were dealing with. He met with victims. He met with families of hostages. But he also said to not let them be consumed by their rage in wanting to respond to this, heinous attack. And he said, we responded with rage to 9/11 and we made mistakes. We sought justice and we got justice, but we also made mistakes. And I think that was a pretty powerful message to send while the country is obviously still engulfed in immense grief, and there's so much anger and wanting to have this retaliatory attack. And so, and you heard the president stress that again in his speech last night, that we made these mistakes after 9/11, and he cautioned Israel to not make the same mistakes. And then in the Oval Office address last night, he really tried to make this moral and I think sort of practical argument about why the U.S. can and should be engaged in two wars at once. One thing that really stood out to me was that he said this was a smart investment for the United States, which I've heard experts say is the argument he needs to make I heard this about Ukraine specifically before everything erupted with Israel and Hamas, but that we don't have American troops on the ground. This will contribute to American security, and therefore this is a good investment for us to make. We don't have to put troops there, but it's going to be better for the U.S. In the big picture that Russia not be able to take over parts of Ukraine or to be able to invade Ukraine without consequence. And he tried to make the same argument for Israel. Obviously, these are extremely different conflicts, but you saw him trying to tie them together. And I think a big part of that is political. There are a lot of Republicans House Republicans who have said they don't want to support Ukraine aid anymore, that it doesn't make sense for the United States to keep sending money, but they are very, very supportive of Israel. And I think the administration is well aware that their best shot to get money for Ukraine, and we've heard that, they're looking in the realm of $60 billion for Ukraine, is to pair it with aid to Israel. And the $60 billion is the figure some people have said they would need to get through the year to not have to vote on another package before the presidential election.
Yes, can I ask you just something about... Sorry, can I just very quickly ask Yasmeen about her first point? Because I've been very struck about this, in that the reaction of the left, and as you said, it has been somewhat limited to the college campuses and the fights on the college campuses, and then maybe a handful of the squad on the Hill and whatnot. But what I think, again, to go to my opening remarks about, this is only going to get worse. And what we've seen, and frankly, I blame Netanyahu for this, the bipartisan nature of support for Israel has basically been abandoned by the Netanyahu government, right? He vocally backed Trump. He showed up on Capitol Hill when Obama was president, at the invitation of House Republicans. AIPAC largely only backs Republicans now. And so the caring and feeding of the American left by the Israeli lobby has basically been non-existent since Netanyahu has been prime minister. And as a result, what you're seeing is the left in general developing a narrative that Israel's a colonial power and a real instinctive anti-Israeli, pro-Palestinian message. The reason I wanted to ask you about it is, if you could do, it's slightly maybe an unfair question, but do a little prognostication in 2024. I mean, a Democratic Party that is much more vocally pro-Palestinian at a time the president is trying to run for re-election, I think does begin to feed the narrative the Republicans have always pushed on the Democratic Party, which is this is a radical party, and Joe Biden may seem like a nice old grandpa, but actually he's a communist in wolf's clothing and all that kind of stuff. Tell me a little bit about how you think that could play out in 2024.
I mean, I think the important point is that this is not a huge segment of the Democratic Party yet, at least the members in Congress. So I don't know how much real pressure they will come under, but I think the bigger question is, what do they do with younger voters? And I don't know that this is like the primary motivating issue for younger voters, but I think it is a challenge in how he tries to sort of thread this needle. And in terms of the Republicans attacking them, I think they're going to do that regardless. But I also think that there is often this pressure with the progressives in the Democratic Party to sort of back down once there is a lot of pressure. I think the best example of this is when a group of progressives wrote a letter last year calling for diplomacy in Ukraine, and they very, very quickly backed off of that and sort of got in line because there was so much blowback. Obviously, this is not necessarily comparable to the Israel-Palestine issue, where it's been much more persistent. But I guess I'm a little bit skeptical that this would be a major issue in 2024, especially if attention sort of fades from the war by then.
Yeah, Yasmeen,
you go first.
Yeah, well, no, go ahead, because I want to frame it in a larger context.
I just have a quick question, because I was really surprised how direct the administration was addressing also the defaults of Netanyahu's policies, and I wonder how strong did and will the president actually demand settlement policies and the overall Israeli policies? Remember, in '73, after Yom Kippur, the shock of Yom Kippur, and we compare it now to that, there was a huge opening for peace development, and we had the agreements. And after such devastating events, there's always a chance to move things on a large scale. I wonder whether the administration thinks that big.
It's a great question. I don't think the administration is going to publicly question Israel too much, at least not in the near term. We've been told that the president and his top aides are doing that in private, asking very tough, direct questions about what their aims are. And they have made this statement several times now where, democracies abide by international law and the rules of war. It clearly indicates that they are concerned about some of Israel's tactics and what they will do. But I think generally the position of the administration has been the Hamas attack in Israel was so heinous that they have no choice but to respond, and they will generally back what they're going to do. We asked several times at different levels, did they try to get any promises that the ground invasion would not happen while the president was on the ground in Tel Aviv? And they said very clearly they did not ask for anything like that they're not telling them what to do. But I think they are concerned about what Israel's aims are. The president has, of course, sort of drawn where his limit, which is that he doesn't think they should reoccupy Gaza again. And I think it still remains to be seen the way this plays out, whether they then start to sort of draw limits on what they're comfortable with Israel doing. But so far, their public posture, at least, has been to support whatever they should do. One thing I do want to note that I thought was really interesting was that when Secretary Blinken began his big tour of the Middle East, where he went to 7 countries, when he went to Israel the first time, he said both publicly and privately, we understand what you need to do in Gaza, and we are fully behind you. And then he started traveling around to the Arab countries and realized that this was trying to get them to condemn the attack, trying to get them to support the U.S. goal in the region and with Israel, and sort of realized in the course of meeting with these leaders that position was not going to be tenable if they wanted to prevent a broader conflict. And so I think that's a dynamic we're seeing unfold right now of how they're going to balance, wanting to back their strongest ally in the Middle East, but also not anger Arab countries and also not force the leaders to respond because of protests in their countries.
I want to piggyback on that because I think this is the next phase. I think Peter is right that fear of escalation really is starting to become the dominant fear in Washington and frankly around the region and around the world. And there's one spark that really can do this, and that's a ground invasion. And I think every single military analyst and most others are raising really serious questions about whether a ground invasion can actually achieve what it set out to achieve. I mean, can you actually, quote, crush Hamas without emptying Gaza? Because that's basically the way you would literally be able to do it at an acceptable price. And then who rules afterwards? Those two big questions, they remain sort of there, and you have the sense the president is asking that quietly, privately, with Netanyahu. I note that Tom Friedman, who has 2 very good sources in the White House, one of whom sits in the Oval Office, has been becoming increasingly vocal on making the case that this is not a good idea. I'm not saying he is the voice of Biden. I think he comes as close to understanding where the thinking is in the White House as almost anyone else. And I have this sense, and Stefan, you put it on the table, right? Maybe there's a way to convince the Israelis not to do this, and the fact that there hasn't been a ground invasion yet is another reason that it pushed to open up. So the question, one, is this the right analysis? And two, if so, how do you convince the Israelis to avoid making a truly big mistake? Peter, you're shaking your head.
I think we have to go back to what we felt, I think, on that Saturday morning when we found out that children and Holocaust survivors were murdered in cold blood, and to ask the Israelis not to do anything about it is just not tenable. It would be akin to us someone saying to us, well, they knocked down the Twin Towers, just let's sue for peace. And I just think that is just not practical.
They have launched
the
largest bombing campaign against Gaza in the history so far. I mean, it's not they haven't done anything. And they've killed a large number of Hamas leaders, and most of the other ones aren't even in Gaza.
I just don't think it's politically tenable, and I don't think it's politically tenable for this government in Israel. And the thing, just to get back to something, frankly, I learned at the knees of the great Ivo Daalder is, if you go into any military campaign, the strategic question you have to ask yourself is, how does this end, right? And Dave Petraeus, frankly, it's been interesting to see his comments about this also, because he's been out saying this is a bad idea as well. You've hit the nail on the head, Ivo, because how does this end? There is no example I can think of in modern military history in which a modern military moves into a region in a counterterrorism, counterinsurgency environment and successfully drains the swamp and kills off just the bad guys and is able to create a stable environment which the more moderate elements turn in and govern the region. It is just not going to happen. And the knock-on effects, let's even say that this is possible. The knock-on effects of what do you do with 2 million Palestinians? You can't put them in Egypt. You can't put them in Jordan, because those two regimes would fall apart. And that's part of the reason why both Egypt and Jordan have not been particularly helpful on this, because they have their own domestic problems particularly in Jordan, with their Palestinian population, and also Sisi himself in terms of stability of his own region, his own country. I mean, given the history of the Arab Spring, you are right in that. If you try to think of it from a purely military endgame, there is not an obvious strategic goal here that is achievable. But I just think right now the politics of this is dominating everything, particularly in Israel. And I don't see Benjamin Netanyahu becoming the Menachem Begin, shaking hands with Sadat, in Camp David. I just don't see that happening.
Yeah, I don't either. But part of it is the question whether the administration is, and or others, and Stefan, before we move on to Poland, which I do want to spend a couple of minutes on, my sense is the Europeans also understand this, and to what extent that is a message that perhaps Scholz brought, perhaps Sunak brought, perhaps von der Leyen can bring.
9/11 clearly teaches us how not to do it. And we now agree that just fighting war for inner relief is not a solution. Netanyahu gave a clear goal for that war. He said he wants to erase Hamas, to get rid us from Hamas. It's a very broad goal. I'm not sure whether he can actually. He should define what that means. Does it mean killing the leadership? Does it mean destroying the tunnels? Does it mean they don't have a say anymore in Gaza? It's a pretty vague goal. And so that also gives him the opportunity to find a way out. But I think he should definitely be forced to think clearly about what he wants to achieve and whether he can do this.
Yasmeen, I want to just jump in here, and what are you hearing in Washington to the extent there is this concern about the ground invasion, and what are they doing about it?
Well, first, I just wanted to go back to a question Stefan asked earlier, which is, whether the Biden administration would try to push for peace or anything like that, or see an opening. And I think they absolutely do not see that opening right now. The president said this himself in the interview with 60 Minutes on Sunday, where and I've heard even people close to him say, he sort of mentions a two-state solution as a bit of an afterthought. But I think really important context here is that this administration has not put a lot into their Middle East policy up until now. I think, like many previous presidents, they don't want to be entangled in the Middle East and then get forcefully pulled back in. But before this, the president himself had not put a ton of time and energy into the Middle East or Middle East policy. He was very much focused, of course, on Ukraine and Russia, and then on countering China. So this is obviously a huge jolt to his foreign policy priorities. And he said in that interview, do you think the Israelis would negotiate a two-state solution right now? And he said, not now, but it needs to be on the table. But I just don't see that being anywhere in the near future. There is no serious effort to that, or even what that would look like at this point. And I'm sorry, Eva, what was your last question?
So the question, interestingly enough, the president did mention this two-state solution in the speech yesterday, again, which was noteworthy, and its absence would have been equally noteworthy, probably. So just to reinforce your point, but also the question was really the worry about the ground invasion and its impact on one, the achievability, which is the 9/11 argument that the president's been making publicly, but also two, if there's one thing that's really going to inflame, this is it. Even more than it already has.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are a lot of concerns about, like we've been talking about, what the aims of the ground invasion are. What exactly does Israel want to accomplish? And to the point that you made, Ivo, a lot of Hamas leaders are not even in Gaza. So what does it mean to fully eradicate them? And this is a group that replaces leaders pretty quickly. And so I think it's very unclear what they mean when they say they want to end Hamas. Does that mean you get rid of every Palestinian in Gaza and raze it to the ground? Does it mean you're targeting specific leaders? Or, I think that's just very unclear. And there's a lot of concern about that. And I think the lesson that could have been anticipated, but I think has been learned in a very difficult way this last week, is that they are really going to lose public and global support the more fierce this campaign in Gaza becomes. And so there was, of course, an outpouring of support for Israel in the wake of the Hamas attack, and of course the horror of people being taken hostage and the brutality of these attacks. But now, we're seeing a lot of attention on the brutality in Gaza. There's been this full siege of food and water and electricity and fuel being cut off. The UN has warned repeatedly that, the siege is in violation of international law, that ordering more than 1 million Gazans to evacuate in 24 hours is an impossible task. And I think you've already very quickly seen public opinion turn based on what we're seeing out of Gaza. Now we have more than I think almost 3 times as many Palestinians who have died than Israelis who died in the initial attacks. And so I think there's a lot of concern about how do you sustain support the longer this goes on, and if it becomes even more brutal than the aerial counterattack we've seen so far.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. By the way, on the question of Hamas, they're also in the West Bank in very large numbers, and so it's it is a social movement that, by the way, I think won the 2006 election. Last time there was an election among the Palestinians. And speaking
also
of
in Doha, yeah.
I mean, to emphasize Stefan's point is, what does it mean to eradicate Hamas, right? I think that's right. But Stefan, speaking of elections, very important election in Poland, a very bitter election fight between the ruling Law and Justice Party and an opposing coalition, Civic Forum, led by former EU Council President Donald Tusk. Surprisingly, I think for many, the coalition won. They have a strong parliamentary majority, and the current government seems to have lost this majority. What's what happened, and what does it all mean?
I guess the Poles were fed up with the way they were governed. It was too radical. It was too overstretched. The way that PiS government and Kaczynski, the person behind it, told lies, and how the way they framed the life in Poland didn't really match with the experience of voters. So this is why they turned away. Now we got the new platform. We got the new 3-party coalition, which still has to be formed. That's a task ahead, because it's not easily done. The guy to watch now is President Duda, who is president by the will and wish of the PiS, the former now outvoted party. Daalder has 30 days to call in for a new government. This new, whoever leader he wants to choose, has 2 weeks to form a government. And guess is that right now he buys time in which the PiS can actually use to both do the final patches to the work they did, and probably even deter from the problems they created, and even the illegalities they leave behind. So there's a lot of talk about files being burned now in Warsaw, and other things being taken away and hidden away. And the other thing is they might look for a loophole, some little escape route where they can still not let this new government get on the vote. But generally, the message is there. There's a 60% majority now for this 3-party coalition, and that's a huge, huge message for everyone who wants democracy in Europe, everyone who wants to get rid of those semi-authoritarian, illiberal and authoritarian type of rulers. It's a message to Viktor Orban in Hungary, who is now the last remaining outhold of that Trumpist type of governing. And it's a good message for Ukraine, because Poland is the stepping stone of all our ways to Ukraine, of weapon deliveries, of aid deliveries, of support, of political support. And the PiS government was wavering in this support. So I guess the baseline is good result, very hopeful. Let's try to get this government into power.
Stefan, can I just ask you, because that last bit you a bit about Orban, because actually, not to disagree with you too much, it's not just Orban anymore. I know everyone's paying attention very closely to the Slovak elections, but Robert Fico was elected again, a Orban-esque figure, just elected back, and I interviewed him as prime minister last time around. Just to what extent do you think the example of Poland, because it is so big and it is such a flag carrier for the region, can have a knock-on influence on the Hungaries and the Slovaks and others in the region that seem to be slipping away into, for lack of a better word, the authoritarian Putin camp? Is that a over-optimistic statement that Poland can influence some of these other countries? Because I was still worried that, despite that, I just remember in Brussels, everyone always said that Poland is different. It's always in play. There is a pro-European civil society there that is win-overable, where I'm not sure that is the case in Hungary or Slovakia anymore.
Well, I'm not sure whether they influence them, but their joint destructive power is now definitely destroyed. And it has a knock-on effect on everyone who wants to copycat this. I mean, there are plenty of countries in Europe. Let's take Italy, Meloni, who definitely has a sort of kind of authoritarian tendency or a populist tendency. And she definitely will think twice now whether this is a good idea. Whether you can change Hungary or not, it's a big thing to do. Orban has really dug in his heels. He's there in power for so long. The country is thinking differently. It's all streamlined. There's no free media anymore. It's a different and very difficult thing to change. But then let's have him isolated. And then the other message, it might work that you hold back money, that the EU is keeping up pressure, that you keep them accountable. Poland now will be rewarded with a lot of money from Brussels, which is held back, and people might feel it. They get the money in their pockets, and so it really pays off being part of that club.
Yeah, and I would just add this. The Poles were Orban's safety valve. And they were each other's safety valve. That safety valve is now gone. They are isolated, and I don't see Fico or anybody else being able to withstand the kind of pressure that Orban and to some extent Warsaw have been able to withstand, given their dependence on the EU. And so the EU's capacity to isolate Hungary and perhaps even to force changes there, as on issues, if we see sanctions on Ukraine, which they didn't want to support, but the Poles did. They were isolated and then they caved.
You're always besmirching the Slovaks, Ivo. Mighty little Slovakia.
Yeah, no, I love the Slovaks. But they know where their interests lie, and it doesn't lie with Orban. It doesn't lie with Putin. It lies with Brussels, because that's where the money is. And money, as a good American would say, talks. And with that, I really want to thank Yasmeen Abutaleb, Stefan Kornelius, and Peter Spiegel. Wonderful conversation. Learned a lot. Hope you all enjoyed learned a lot as well. Want to thank all of you for tuning in, and we'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Till then, have a great weekend.